They thought she was just another high-powered media executive, and the quiet man sitting 3 rows behind her was just a single father flying home with his teenage daughter. They were dead wrong. What happened next at 35,000 feet would leave an entire plane in stunned silence, and the world watching in awe. When armed hijackers stormed the first-class cabin demanding ransom for media mogul Celine Thalric, they had no idea that Owen Trellis, the unassuming man in economy, was a decorated ex-Navy combat specialist who had spent years taking down terrorist cells. In 18 terrifying minutes, one father would reveal skills that seemed impossible, save hundreds of lives, and receive a proposal that would change everything he thought he knew about his future. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Boeing 757 hummed steadily through the afternoon sky, 35,000 feet above the Colorado Rockies. Flight 447 from Denver to Atlanta carried the usual mix of business travelers, families, and tourists, all settling into the familiar rhythm of a 3-hour journey. In first class, Celine Thalric adjusted her laptop screen and reviewed the quarterly earnings report that would make headlines tomorrow morning. As CEO of Meridian Media Group, one of the largest independent broadcasting networks in the country, she commanded a media empire worth billions. Celine's tailored charcoal suit spoke of boardroom authority, her auburn hair pulled back in a precise chignon that had withstood 6 board meetings and 2 press conferences that week. At 38, she had built Meridian from a struggling local TV station into a media powerhouse that rivaled the major networks. Her deep green eyes, which had stared down corporate raiders and hostile takeover attempts, now focused intently on profit margins and market projections. 3 rows behind her in economy class, Owen Trellis helped his 16-year-old daughter Morelle adjust her earbuds as she settled in with a book. Owen wore a simple navy polo shirt and well-worn jeans, the kind of clothes that spoke of someone who valued comfort over appearance. His weathered hands showed years of hard work, and his graying temples suggested a man in his early 40s who had seen more than his share of stress to his fellow passengers. Owen appeared to be exactly what he seemed, a single father traveling home from a weekend college visit with his daughter. His soft-spoken manner and patient demeanor with Morelle painted the picture of a devoted parent, perhaps a teacher or an accountant, someone whose biggest concern was making sure his daughter got into a good university. Morelle Trellis was a bright teenager with her father's quiet intensity and her mother's quick wit. She had inherited Owen's steel blue eyes and possessed the kind of natural confidence that came from being raised by a parent who treated her as an equal partner in their small family unit. She was studying for her SATs while researching journalism programs, dreaming of one day working for a major news organization. Near the front of the plane, a different kind of passenger studied the layout with calculating eyes. Sandro Dramer had boarded with a first-class ticket and designer luggage, presenting himself as a successful tech entrepreneur. His expensive suit and confident demeanor had drawn approving nods from the flight crew. What they didn't know was that Sandro had spent months planning this flight, studying passenger manifests and security protocols. Behind his charming smile and polished exterior, Sandro harbored a dangerous obsession with Celine Thalric. Her media empire had exposed his previous criminal enterprises, leading to the collapse of his legitimate business ventures and a federal investigation that had destroyed his reputation. While he had avoided prosecution through expensive lawyers and technicalities, his life had been ruined. Now he wanted revenge, and he wanted the world to watch. Sandro's plan was audacious in its simplicity. Take control of the flight, demand a massive ransom for Celine's safe return, and broadcast the entire ordeal live on social media. He had recruited 2 accomplices who had boarded separately: Tavrik Holtrow, a former private security contractor who had been dishonorably discharged for excessive violence, and Kieran Dravith, a tech specialist with a grudge against corporate America. Tavrik sat in the middle section, his broad shoulders and thick neck suggesting a man comfortable with physical confrontation. He had traded his military training for work with private military contractors, building a reputation for ruthless efficiency. When Sandro had approached him with this plan, the promise of easy money and a chance to strike back at the system had been irresistible. Kieran occupied a window seat near the back, his laptop bag containing sophisticated hacking equipment disguised as everyday electronics. He was the type of person who believed that corporate executives like Celine were everything wrong with America, concentrating wealth and power while ordinary people struggled. To him, this wasn't just a crime. It was a form of social justice. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with professional efficiency, unaware that they were serving refreshments to both victim and predators. Lead flight attendant Sarah Chun had worked for Skyline Airways for 12 years and prided herself on reading passengers well. She noticed Celine's focused intensity, Owen's gentle attentiveness to his daughter, and even Sandro's apparent success and confidence. Everything seemed normal. As the plane cruised over Kansas, Celine finished reviewing her reports and allowed herself a moment to gaze out the window at the patchwork farmland below. She had been traveling constantly for weeks, negotiating acquisition deals and defending her company against competitors who saw Meridian's independence as a weakness to exploit. The flight to Atlanta would take her to a crucial board meeting where she would announce Meridian's expansion into streaming services, a move that would either secure the company's future or leave it vulnerable to larger predators. Owen watched Morel read, her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked through a particularly challenging passage in her AP literature book. He felt the familiar mix of pride and protective concern that defined his relationship with his daughter. Since her mother's death in a car accident 5 years earlier, it had been just the two of them against the world. He had left his previous career to focus on raising her, taking a job as a facilities manager at a community college in Boulder that offered steady hours and good benefits, what none of his fellow passengers could have guessed was that Owen's previous career had been 12 years as a Navy SEAL, including multiple deployments to some of the world's most dangerous places. He had earned commendations for valor and participated in classified operations that had disrupted terrorist networks and saved countless lives. But that life had ended the day he became a single father, replaced by soccer games, homework help, and the quiet satisfaction of watching his daughter grow into a remarkable young woman. The transformation from elite warrior to suburban dad had been deliberate and complete. Owen had shed every visible trace of his military background, from his bearing to his speech patterns. He had learned to blend into civilian life so thoroughly that even his neighbors in Boulder had no idea about his past. To them, he was simply Mr. Trellis, the nice man who coached youth soccer and volunteered at the school library. But old habits died hard, and certain instincts never fully disappeared. Even now, relaxed in his economy seat, Owen's peripheral vision tracked the movement of passengers and crew throughout the cabin. His mind automatically noted exit locations, potential improvised weapons, and the behavioral patterns of everyone around him. It was unconscious now, as natural as breathing, a legacy of years when such awareness meant the difference between life and death. Sandro checked his watch and exchanged subtle glances with his accomplices. In 30 minutes, when the plane was over rural Missouri with limited options for emergency landing, they would make their move. He had timed everything perfectly, studied every detail, planned for every contingency. What he hadn't planned for was Owen Trellis. As the afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the aisles, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test every assumption about who these people really were. In the minds of everyone aboard Flight 447, Celine Thalric was a powerful but vulnerable target. Sandro Dramier was a successful businessman, and Owen Trellis was just another father trying to get his daughter home safely. They were about to discover how wrong they could be. The beverage Service had just concluded when Sandro Draymir made his decision. The flight attendants were securing the service carts, and most passengers had settled into the drowsy comfort of cruising altitude. Perfect timing. He stood slowly, stretching as if working out a cramp, and moved toward the first-class restroom. But instead of entering, he positioned himself behind Celine Thalrick's seat. "Miss Thalrick," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough edge to make her look up from her laptop. "I think it's time we talked." Celine's expression shifted from mild curiosity to alarm as she took in Sandro's position and the cold intensity in his eyes. Before she could respond, Tavrik Holtrow rose from his middle seat, his massive frame blocking the aisle as he moved forward. Passengers began to notice the unusual movement, conversations quieting as a subtle tension filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sandro announced, his voice now carrying throughout the first-class section, "I need everyone to remain calm and stay in your seats. We're going to be making some changes to today's flight plan." The transformation was immediate and terrifying. Sandro's polished businessman persona evaporated, replaced by someone who clearly relished having power over others. Tavrick's hand moved to his jacket, revealing the outline of what appeared to be a weapon, though airport security had forced him to be creative with materials that wouldn't trigger metal detectors. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. From the back of the plane, Kieran Dravith activated his equipment, jamming the aircraft's communications and beginning to broadcast a live stream to social media platforms he had prepared in advance. Within minutes, the hashtag Flight 447 hostage was trending as viewers around the world tuned in to watch the drama unfold in real time. "This is very simple," Sandro continued, now standing beside Celine's seat with Tavrik looming behind him. "Meridian Media Group has destroyed lives with their so-called investigative journalism. Today, the chickens come home to roost. Miss Thalrick here is going to transfer $50 million to accounts we've prepared, and then we're going to have a very public conversation about corporate responsibility." Celine's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "The plane's crew won't allow this. Air traffic control will know something's wrong." Sandro smiled coldly. "Air traffic control is hearing everything they expect to hear, thanks to my associate. As for the crew, well, let's see how cooperative they are when passengers' lives are at stake." Flight attendant Sarah Chun had moved forward at the first sign of trouble, but Tavrick's imposing presence and the implied threat of violence made her stop short. Her training had prepared her for various emergency scenarios, but an organized hijacking with sophisticated technical support was beyond what any airline employee was equipped to handle. "Sir, please return to your seat," Sarah said, her voice professionally calm despite the circumstances. "Whatever problem you're having, we can work it out." Tavrik stepped toward her, his size and predatory smile making his intentions clear. "Lady, the only problem we're going to have is if people don't follow instructions. Now get back there and tell everyone to stay calm while we conduct our business." The other passengers in first class sat frozen, caught between the instinct to help and the very real fear that any movement might trigger violence. An elderly businessman clutched his wife's hand as she whispered prayers. A young couple on their honeymoon stared in disbelief, unable to process that their dream vacation was turning into a nightmare. Behind them in business class, word was beginning to spread about the disturbance up front. Passengers craned their necks trying to see what was happening, while others pulled out phones to call loved ones, only to discover that their devices had no signal thanks to Kieran's jamming equipment. "Here's how this works," Sandro continued, pulling out a tablet that showed Celine's banking and corporate accounts in real time. "You're going to authorize the transfer right now while we're live on the internet for everyone to see. The world is going to watch Meridian Media Group pay for its crimes." Celine looked at the tablet, recognizing her own financial information displayed with disturbing accuracy. These men had been planning this for months, studying her company's structure and her personal assets with the kind of detail that spoke of serious criminal organization. Even if I wanted to, she said carefully, those kinds of transfers require multiple authorizations. I can't just move $50 million from my phone. Sandro's expression darkened. We know exactly what you can and can't do, Miss Thalric. We've studied your company's structure for months. You have emergency executive powers that allow for rapid financial decisions. Use them. 3 rows back in economy, Owen Trellis had been watching the situation develop with growing concern. The moment Sandro had stood up and approached Celine, Owen's instincts had kicked into high gear. He recognized the coordinated movement, the careful timing, the professional execution of what was clearly a planned operation. Morel had noticed her father's sudden alertness, the way his casual posture had shifted into something more focused and intense. Dad, what's happening up there? She whispered. Trouble. Owen replied quietly, his eyes never leaving the first-class section. Stay calm and keep your head down. Don't draw attention to yourself. Owen's mind was racing through tactical assessments. 3 perpetrators, at least 2 of them large enough to be physically dangerous. Sophisticated technical support, suggesting this wasn't amateur hour. The leader showing signs of personal vendetta rather than purely financial motivation, which made him potentially more dangerous because he might not be purely rational in his decision-making. The narrow confines of the aircraft presented both opportunities and challenges. Limited space meant that any physical confrontation would be close quarters, where his training would be most effective. But it also meant that innocent passengers would be in immediate danger, and any mistake could result in catastrophic consequences at 35,000 feet. We're not asking for your cooperation, Tavrik said to Celine. His voice carrying the kind of casual menace that suggested violence was always his preferred solution. We're telling you what's going to happen. The only question is whether other people get hurt in the process. To emphasize his point, Tavrik moved toward the elderly couple, the husband instinctively placing himself between his wife and the threatening stranger. Please, the old man said, his voice shaking. We're just trying to get home to see our grandchildren. Sandro held up a hand, stopping Tavrik for the moment. Nobody has to get hurt if everyone does what they're told. This is about corporate accountability, not innocent passengers. But make no mistake, we will do whatever is necessary to get the message across. The threat hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming the aircraft cabin from a space of routine travel into a pressure cooker of fear and potential violence. Passengers who had been strangers minutes before now found themselves bound together by shared danger, each wondering if they would see their families again. Owen knew that he was running out of time to act. Every minute that passed allowed the hijackers to solidify their control and increase the danger to everyone aboard. But he also knew that any move he made would have to be decisive and complete. There would be no second chances at 35,000 feet. Morel squeezed her father's hand, sensing the tension radiating from him even though his exterior remained calm. She had never seen him like this before, the quiet intensity replacing his usual gentle demeanor. For the first time in her young life, she was beginning to understand that there were depths to her father that she had never suspected. The next few minutes would determine whether Flight 447 became a tragedy that shocked the world or a story of courage that inspired it. And at the center of it all, a man who had left his warrior's life behind was about to discover that some battles choose you, no matter how far you run. The tension in the first-class cabin had reached a breaking point. Sandro's patience was wearing thin as Celine continued to resist his demands, and Tavrik was becoming increasingly agitated, his hand moving closer to the improvised weapon concealed in his jacket. The live stream was drawing millions of viewers, turning the aircraft into a stage for international drama. Last chance. Ms. Thalric, Sandro said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Authorization codes. Now, or we start making examples of passengers until you comply. Celine's Resolve was cracking under the pressure, but she knew that giving in to these demands would only encourage more attacks on corporate executives. "I won't be blackmailed," she said, though her voice betrayed her fear. "And I won't set a precedent that rewards terrorism." Tavrik stepped toward the elderly couple again, this time with clear intent. "Then let's see how you feel about precedents when people start dying because of your stubbornness." It was at that moment that Owen Trellis knew he could no longer remain a passive observer. Every instinct he had developed over 12 years of special operations was screaming that the situation was about to escalate beyond control. These men weren't bluffing, and innocent people were about to pay the price for his inaction. But Owen's first concern wasn't tactical success or stopping the hijackers. It was morale. His daughter was seated next to him, and any action he took would put her in potential danger. The father in him wanted to keep his head down, protect his own family, and hope that somehow the situation would resolve itself without violence. The warrior in him knew better. "Morel," he whispered, leaning close to his daughter's ear, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. When I tell you to, I want you to get down on the floor and stay there until everything stops moving. Can you do that? Can you do that?" Morel looked into her father's eyes and saw something she had never seen before. Not fear, but a kind of cold calculation that spoke of experience with situations far more dangerous than anything in their quiet life in Boulder. "Dad, what are you going to do?" "What I have to," Owen replied simply. "I love you more than anything in this world, and that's why I can't let this happen." He kissed her forehead gently, the same way he had every night since she was small, and then stood up from his seat. Owen's movement was casual at first, the natural stretch of a passenger who had been sitting too long. He moved into the aisle and began walking toward the front of the plane, his pace unhurried, his expression showing nothing more than mild concern. To the hijackers, he appeared to be just another passenger who didn't understand the gravity of the situation. "Sir, please return to your seat," Sarah Chun called out, recognizing Owen from the boarding process as the quiet father traveling with his daughter. "Everything is under control." Owen continued walking, his eyes now locked on Tavrik, who was reaching for the elderly woman's arm. "No," Owen said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "It's not." Sandro turned to look at this new disruption, irritation flashing across his features. "Get back to your seat, before you get yourself hurt. This doesn't concern you." Owen was now only a few feet away from the first-class section, close enough to see the fear in Celine's eyes and the cruel anticipation in Tavrik's. "Actually," he said, his voice taking on a different quality, the casual civilian tone replaced by something that belonged to command structures and life-or-death decisions. "It concerns me very much." Tavrik released the elderly woman and moved to intercept Owen, his bulk and aggressive posture designed to intimidate. "Look, hero, I don't know what you think you're going to accomplish, but you're about to get people killed with your stupidity." Owen stopped walking and looked directly at Tavrik, and something passed between them in that moment. Recognition, perhaps, or the acknowledgement that they were no longer dealing with civilians and terrorists, but with two men who understood violence in ways that most people never would. "I'm going to give you one chance," Owen said quietly, his voice now carrying an authority that made everyone in the cabin stop and listen. "Release the passengers, surrender your weapons, and this ends peacefully." Tavrik laughed, a sound without humor. "You're going to give me a chance? Do you have any idea what you're dealing with here?" Owen's expression didn't change. Former private military contractor, probably discharged for conduct unbecoming. Adequate training, poor discipline, tendency to rely on intimidation rather than skill. "You've been in scraps, but you've never been in a real fight." The accuracy of Owen's assessment hit Tavrik like a physical blow. How could this ordinary-looking man read him so clearly? "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who's very good at stopping people like you," Owen replied. Sandro had been watching this exchange with growing alarm. This wasn't going according to plan. The quiet passenger was supposed to be intimidated back to his seat, not engaging in psychological warfare with his muscle. "Tavrik, handle this. Now." Tavrik reached for his weapon, but Owen was already moving. What happened next defied the expectations of everyone on the plane, including Celine Thalreek, who had witnessed corporate negotiations and hostile board meetings, but had never seen a human being move with such precise, controlled lethality. Owen's hand intercepted Tavrik's arm before the weapon could clear his jacket, fingers finding nerve clusters that caused the bigger man's hand to go numb instantly. Owen's other hand struck Tavrik's throat with precisely calibrated force, enough to disable but not to kill, dropping the former contractor to his knees in seconds. The movement was so fast and efficient that most passengers didn't fully understand what they had witnessed. One moment there had been a confrontation. The next moment, the threat was neutralized with surgical precision. Sandro stared in shock as his primary enforcer collapsed, gasping for air and clutching his throat. "That's impossible. Who are you?" Owen straightened his polo shirt and looked at Sandro with the same calm expression he might wear while helping Morel with her homework. "I'm a father trying to get his daughter home safely. And you're in my way. Behind them." Kieran Dravith was frantically working his equipment, trying to understand how the situation had shifted so dramatically. The live stream viewers were exploding with comments and theories, but none of them came close to the truth about who Owen Trellis really was. Celine stared at her unexpected protector, seeing him clearly for the first time. The humble demeanor and civilian clothes couldn't hide what had just happened. This man had neutralized a trained combatant with the kind of ease that spoke of extensive experience with violence and the restraint that came from understanding its consequences. "Morel," Owen called back to his daughter without taking his eyes off Sandro. "Get down now." His daughter immediately dropped to the floor behind the seats, her complete trust in her father's instructions, born from 16 years of never being led astray by his guidance. Owen took a step toward Sandro, and the hijacker backing away, suddenly understanding that he was no longer the predator in this situation. "Now then," Owen said conversationally, "let's discuss how this is going to end." For the first time since boarding the plane, Sandro Drammer was afraid. The aircraft cabin had become a theater of disbelief. Tavrik Holtrow, all 240 pounds of former military contractor, remained on his knees clutching his throat, his eyes wide with shock at the speed and precision of his defeat. The weapon he had been reaching for lay forgotten in his jacket as his nervous system struggled to process what Owen Trellis had done to him. Sandro Drammer backed away from Owen, his carefully constructed plan unraveling in real time as millions of viewers watched the live stream. "This isn't over," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Kieran, initiate Protocol 7. From the back of the plane, Kieran Dravith began typing frantically on his hidden equipment. Within seconds, the cabin lights flickered and the aircraft's entertainment systems displayed a message that made every passenger's blood run cold. "Explosive device armed. Compliance required or all passengers will be eliminated." Owen's jaw tightened as he assessed this new threat. The message could be a bluff, but given the sophistication of their planning so far, he couldn't take that chance. "Where is it?" he asked Sandro directly. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Sandro replied, his confidence returning now that he held the ultimate leverage. "My associate has placed a device somewhere on this aircraft. The only way to disarm it is through his computer, and the only way he'll do that is if Miss Thalreek complies with our demands." Celine had gone pale at the mention of explosives, but she forced herself to speak. "Even if I authorize the transfer, how do I know you won't kill everyone anyway?" Sandro's smile was cold and calculated. "You don't, but you definitely know what happens if you refuse." Owen was running calculations in his mind, assessing distances and angles throughout the cabin. Kieran was approximately 40 rows back, which meant navigating through a maze of passengers and seats while potentially dealing with additional security measures. The confined space of the aircraft made stealth impossible, but it also limited Kieran's options for escape or defense. "I'm going to make you a counter-proposal," Owen said to Sandro, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people listen despite themselves. "You're going to tell your friend to disarm whatever device he's prepared, and then you're going to surrender peacefully." Sandro laughed harshly. "And why exactly would I do that?" Owen's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted slightly, a subtle realignment that spoke of coiled violence waiting for release. "Because the alternative is that I demonstrate exactly what 12 years as a Navy SEAL taught me about close-quarters combat in confined spaces." The words hit the cabin like a physical force. Passengers who had been watching in confused terror suddenly understood what they were witnessing. The quiet man in the polo shirt wasn't just someone with basic self-defense training. He was a decorated special operations veteran whose entire professional life had been spent in situations exactly like this. Tavrik managed to gasp out a warning, "Sandro, this guy's the real deal. We need to abort." But Sandro's obsession with Celine and Meridian Media Group had driven him beyond rational thought. "I don't care if he's Superman. Kieran has that device, and if anything happens to us, 200 innocent people die along with his precious media princess." Owen nodded slowly, as if Sandro had just confirmed something he suspected. "That's where you're wrong about two things. First, there is no device. Your friend back there is running a psychological operation, hoping fear will make people compliant. Second, I'm not here to be anyone's hero. I'm here to protect my daughter and get her home safely." The certainty in Owen's voice cut through the panic like a blade. Celine found herself studying his face, looking for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. She found none. This man had made his assessment and was proceeding based on information and experience that none of them could comprehend. "You're bluffing," Sandro said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," Owen replied simply. "I'm trained to identify explosive devices and their signatures. I'm trained to assess psychological operations and their effectiveness. And most importantly, I'm trained to know when someone is lying to protect themselves at others' expense." Owen began walking toward the back of the plane, his movement purposeful but not rushed. Passengers instinctively leaned away from the aisle, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary and dangerous. "Stop!" Sandro shouted. "One more step and Kieran detonates." Owen paused and looked back at Sandro with something that might have been pity. "If your friend had a real explosive device, you wouldn't be standing in first class having this conversation. You'd be in a secured location with remote detonation capability. The fact that you're here, exposed and vulnerable, tells me everything I need to know about the legitimacy of your threat." He resumed walking, and this time Sandro's desperation broke through his facade of control. "Kieran, do something!" From the back of the plane came the sound of frantic typing, followed by a new message on the entertainment screens. "Device malfunction. Emergency protocols activated." Owen smiled grimly. "And there it is. When faced with actual resistance, your psychological operation falls apart because it was never based on real capability." Kieran Dravith was no longer the confident tech specialist who had boarded the plane. He was a frightened young man watching his sophisticated plan crumble under the assault of someone who understood both technology and human psychology better than he did. As Owen approached his row, Kieran's hands shook as he tried to initiate some kind of backup plan. "Son," Owen said, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher addressing a struggling student, "you're very good with computers, but you've never dealt with someone who's been trained to think 3 steps ahead of every possible scenario." Kieran looked up at Owen, seeing something in those steel blue eyes that made him understand just how badly he had miscalculated. This wasn't a random passenger who could be intimidated or confused. This was a professional who had spent years dealing with people far more dangerous and sophisticated than Kieran could ever hope to be. "The device," Kieran whispered. his voice barely audible above the aircraft's engines. "It's not real. It was just supposed to make people afraid." Owen nodded as if this confirmed what he had already known. Fear is a tool, but it only works when people believe in the threat behind it. The moment you meet someone who can see through the illusion, the whole structure collapses. He reached down and gently took Kieran's laptop, the younger man offering no resistance. Within seconds, Owen had shut down the jamming equipment and restored normal communications throughout the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the voice of Captain Rodriguez over the intercom. "This is your captain. We've regained full communications and are in contact with air traffic control. Please remain in your seats while we assess the situation." Owen made his way back toward the front of the plane, carrying Kieran's equipment and leaving behind a thoroughly defeated young man who was beginning to understand the full consequences of his actions. The passengers he passed looked at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief, unable to fully process what they had witnessed. Sandro was still standing in first class, but his defiant posture had collapsed into something approaching panic. With Kieran neutralized and Tavrik still struggling to recover from his encounter with Owen's training, the hijacking had become a one-man operation without any real leverage. "It's over," Owen said simply as he approached Sandro. "Your team is finished. Your technology is disabled, and your threats were hollow. The only question now is whether you're going to surrender peacefully, or if I'm going to have to demonstrate more of what I learned in Navy." Celine watched this unfold with growing amazement. In less than 10 minutes, Owen Trellis had systematically dismantled a sophisticated hijacking operation using nothing but tactical knowledge, psychological insight, and the kind of controlled precision that spoke of extensive combat experience. But what impressed her most wasn't his skill with violence. It was his restraint. Despite having the capability to inflict serious harm on the hijackers, he had used only the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. This was a man who understood power and chose to wield it responsibly. Sandro looked around the cabin, seeing his operation in ruins and his grand gesture of revenge reduced to an embarrassing failure broadcast live to the world. "This isn't justice," he said weakly. Owen's expression softened slightly, showing the first hint of the gentle father that his daughter knew. "Justice isn't about revenge or making grand gestures. It's about protecting innocent people from those who would harm them." And that's exactly what just happened here. As if to emphasize the point, Flight 447's communication system crackled to life with contact from air traffic control and federal authorities who had been monitoring the situation. The real world was reasserting itself, and with it would come consequences for the 3 men who had turned a routine flight into a nightmare. But for Owen Trellis, the important thing wasn't the justice that would be served by the courts. It was the fact that morale was safe, the passengers were unharmed, and he could return to being just a father trying to get his daughter home. The warrior had emerged when needed, done what was necessary, and was already fading back into the gentle man who coached soccer and helped with homework. But everyone on Flight 447 would remember what they had witnessed, and some of them would never look at quiet, unassuming people the same way again. As federal air marshals who had been discreetly positioned throughout the plane emerged to take the hijackers into custody, Owen Trellis made his way back to his seat where Morel waited. His daughter's eyes were wide with questions, but she trusted him enough to wait for explanations rather than demanding them in the middle of the chaos. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Owen asked, crouching beside her seat to check for any signs of distress or fear. Morel nodded slowly, her gaze searching her father's face for clues about what had just happened. "Dad, how did you know how to do all that? I've never seen you fight anyone, not even when those guys were bothering us at the park last year." Owen settled back into his seat, running a hand through his graying hair as he considered how to answer. The careful separation he had maintained between his past life and his role as a father was crumbling, and he owed her honesty about who he really was. "Before you were born, before I met your mother, I had a different job," he said carefully. I was in the Navy, and I did things that required special training. When your mom died, and it was just you and me, I decided that part of my life was over. I wanted to focus on being the best father I could be. Morel absorbed this information with the serious consideration she brought to all important matters. Is that why we moved to Boulder? So you could take care of me better? Partly, Owen admitted. But mostly because I realized that the most important mission I would ever have was raising you to be a good person. Everything else was just preparation for that. Their conversation was interrupted by Celine Thalrick, who approached their row with obvious hesitation. Up close, Owen could see that beneath her composed exterior, she was still processing the trauma of being held hostage and the shock of her unexpected rescue. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I don't want to intrude, but I needed to thank you for what you did. You saved my life and probably the lives of everyone on this plane." Owen looked up at her with the same gentle expression Morel knew from bedtime stories and scraped knee emergencies. "You don't need to thank me, ma'am. I just did what anyone would do in that situation." Celine's laugh held no humor. "What anyone would do? Mr. Trellis, what you did was extraordinary. Those men had been planning this for months. They had sophisticated equipment, detailed knowledge of my company's financial structure, and contingency plans for multiple scenarios. You dismantled their entire operation in minutes. They made fundamental errors." Owen replied, his tone suggesting he was discussing a mechanical problem rather than a life-threatening situation. "They relied too heavily on intimidation and not enough on actual capability. When faced with real resistance, their plan fell apart because it was built on assumptions rather than solid tactical foundation." Morel listened to this exchange with growing understanding of just how much about her father she had never known. The quiet confidence she had always seen in him during difficult situations now made sense in a completely different context. "Dad," she said quietly, "is this why you always know what to do when things go wrong? Like when Mrs. Patterson's husband had that heart attack, or when the Johnsons' house caught fire." Owen smiled at his daughter, remembering those incidents differently now that his secret was partially out. "I suppose I learned to assess situations quickly and take appropriate action. But the most important thing I learned is that you help people when they need it, and you don't make a big deal about it afterward." Celine studied Owen's face, seeing something in his expression that spoke of experiences far beyond anything in her corporate world. "May I ask what you do now? I mean, for work?" "I'm a facilities manager at Colorado Mountain Community College," Owen replied without embarrassment. "I make sure the buildings are safe, the equipment works, and the students have a good environment for learning. It's honest work, and it lets me be home every evening with Morel." The contrast between Owen's current humble position and what Celine had just witnessed was staggering. Here was a man who could have leveraged his military experience into lucrative private security work or consulting contracts, but had instead chosen a quiet life that prioritized his daughter's needs above his own career advancement. "You gave up everything to be a single parent," Celine said, the statement carrying a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Owen shook his head gently. "I didn't give up anything important. I gained the most meaningful job I've ever had." He looked at Morel with obvious love and pride. "This young lady is going to change the world someday. My job is just to make sure she has every opportunity to do it." Morel blushed at her father's praise, but Celine could see the strong bond between them, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. It was clear that Owen's devotion to his daughter wasn't born from duty or obligation, but from the recognition that she was the best thing he had ever done with his life. "What do you want to be when you grow up, Morel?" Celine asked, genuinely curious about this remarkable young woman. "A journalist," Morel replied immediately. "I want to write stories that matter, that help people understand important things happening in the world. Dad always says that the truth is the most powerful weapon there is, and I want to use it to help people." Celine felt something stir in her chest at these words. Here was a teenager who spoke about journalism with the kind of idealism that had originally drawn Celine to media work, before corporate pressures and financial realities had complicated her mission. "That's a wonderful goal," Celine said. "The world needs journalists who understand that the truth is worth fighting for." Owen watched this exchange with interest, noting how Celine's voice changed when she talked about journalism as a calling rather than a business. Beneath the corporate executive exterior, he sensed someone who still believed in the fundamental mission of informing the public and holding power accountable. The aircraft was beginning its descent into Atlanta, and federal agents were conducting preliminary interviews with passengers while the hijackers were secured in custody. Owen knew that he would soon have to deal with extensive debriefing sessions and probably media attention that would shatter the quiet anonymity he had built in Boulder. "Mr. Trellis," Celine said carefully, "I know this might seem presumptuous, but I want you to know that if you ever decide you want to leave facilities management, Meridian Media Group would be honored to have someone with your skills and values on our team." Owen smiled politely. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm quite happy where I am. Morel has 2 more years of high school, and my priority is being there for her through that transition." "Of course," Celine replied quickly. "I understand completely. But if your circumstances ever change, please know that the offer stands. What you did today showed not just extraordinary skill, but the kind of judgment and character that can't be taught." Morel looked between her father and Celine with the perceptive intelligence that had always impressed Owen. She could sense undercurrents in their conversation that went beyond professional respect, though she wasn't quite sure what to make of them. Double quotes, "Miss Thalrick," Morel said suddenly, "what made you want to run a media company?" Celine was surprised by the directness of the question, but something about Morel's sincere interest made her want to give an honest answer. "I believed that information was power, and that power should belong to everyone, not just those who could afford to control it. I wanted to build something that would tell important stories regardless of whether they were profitable or popular. Do you still believe that?" Morel asked with the fearless curiosity of someone too young to understand that some questions were considered impolite. Celine paused, considering her answer carefully. "Yes, I do. Though I'll admit it's become more complicated as the company has grown. Sometimes the business side and the mission side don't align perfectly." Owen observed this conversation with growing respect for Celine Thalrick. She could have given Morel a polished corporate response, but instead she was treating his daughter as an equal worthy of honest discussion about complex issues. As the plane touched down in Atlanta, Owen realized that this brief encounter had changed something fundamental about his carefully constructed life. The secret of his past was out, at least partially, and he would have to figure out how to integrate that reality with his role as Morel's father. But more than that, he had met someone who seemed to understand that true strength came not from what you could do, but from what you chose to do with your capabilities. Celine Thalrick had built a media empire, but she was still someone who believed in using power responsibly. And that, Owen thought as he helped Morel gather her belongings, was something worth respecting. The federal holding facility at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport buzzed with activity as agents processed the 3 hijackers and conducted interviews with passengers from Flight 447. Owen Trellis sat in a sterile conference room, having just completed his 3rd hour of debriefing with FBI counterterrorism specialists who were struggling to understand how a community college facilities manager had single-handedly neutralized a sophisticated hijacking operation. Special Agent Maria Santos closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, studying Owen with professional curiosity. "Mr. Trellis, your service record is remarkable. 12 years with SEAL Team 6, multiple classified operations, commendations for valor. The question I have is why someone with your background chose to completely disappear from that world." Owen glanced through the conference room window where Morel sat reading in the waiting area. A victim services coordinator keeping her company with hot chocolate and magazines. Agent Santos, when you become a single parent, your priorities change completely. My daughter needed stability and presence, not a father who was deployed half the year to places he couldn't talk about. But surely there were opportunities in private security, consulting, training, Santos pressed. Your skills are extremely valuable in the current security environment. My skills are exactly why I chose a different path, Owen replied quietly. I'd seen enough violence to last several lifetimes. I wanted to build something instead of destroying things. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Another agent entered, carrying a tablet with a troubled expression. Agent Santos, we've got a problem. The hijacker Sandro Dramer is demanding to speak specifically with Owen Trellis. He claims they have a history together. Owen felt his stomach drop as pieces of a puzzle he had hoped would never resurface began falling into place. What did he say exactly? The agent consulted his notes. He said, and I quote, "Tell Commander Trellis that Kabul remembers." Does that mean anything to you? Owen was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing back to an operation 7 years earlier that had ended his military career and nearly cost him his sanity. Agent Santos, I need to see him. That's highly irregular, Santos replied. We don't typically allow private citizens to interview suspects in federal custody. I'm not a private citizen in this context, Owen said, his voice taking on the authority that had once commanded special operations teams. I'm the only person who can tell you why Sandro Dramer specifically targeted Celine Thalric and how he knew exactly which flight she would be on. 20 minutes later, Owen sat across from Sandro Dramer in an interview room, separated by a metal table and 7 years of bitter history. Sandro's polished businessman facade had cracked completely, revealing something darker and more desperate underneath. Hello, Marcus, Sandro said, using Owen's old military call sign with deliberate malice. You look different, softer. Fatherhood suits you. Owen studied the man across from him, seeing past the expensive suit to the scared, angry person beneath. You've aged, Victor. Prison will do that to a man. Agent Santos, monitoring from the observation room, made a note about the apparent alias. Whatever history these two men shared was deeper and more complex than a simple hijacking case. You remember me, Sandro said with satisfaction. Good. I wasn't sure if I was memorable enough to stick in the mind of the great commander. Marcus, I remember everything about Kabul, Owen replied evenly, including why you ended up in a federal prison instead of a military cemetery. Sandro's face twisted with old rage. You destroyed my life, my career, my reputation, my freedom. Everything I built, gone because you decided to play hero. Owen leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to the tone he had once used during interrogations. I didn't destroy anything, Victor. You did that yourself when you decided to sell weapons to insurgents. I just made sure it stopped. The story that emerged over the next hour painted a picture of betrayal and corruption that explained both Sandro's motivation and his intimate knowledge of Owen's capabilities. 7 years earlier, Viktor Kozlov had been a military contractor working alongside Owen's SEAL team in Afghanistan. Officially, he provided logistics and local intelligence support. Unofficially, he had been selling American weapons and equipment to Taliban forces for massive profits. Owen's team had been tasked with investigating a series of ambushes that seemed to indicate insider knowledge of American operations. The investigation had led directly to Victor, who had been caught in the act of transferring advanced communications equipment to known terrorists. You could have looked the other way, Sandro said, his voice heavy with accusation. Everyone was making money on the side. It was just business. It was treason, Owen replied without emotion. And it got American soldiers killed. That's not business, Victor. That's murder. Owen's testimony had been instrumental in Victor's conviction on charges of providing material support to terrorists, arms trafficking, and conspiracy. Victor had served 5 years in federal prison before being released 2 years ago. During his incarceration, he had legally changed his name to Sandro Draymir and begun planning his revenge. But why Celine Thalric? Owen asked. She had nothing to do with what happened in Kabul. Sandro's smile was cold and calculating. Meridian Media Group ran a documentary series about military contractor corruption. They featured my case prominently, even used my real name and mugshot. When I got out of prison, I couldn't get legitimate work because everyone knew who I was. She made sure of that. The pieces were falling into place for Owen. Sandro's plan hadn't been just about money or even revenge against Celine specifically. It had been about destroying the man who had ended his criminal career while simultaneously striking back at the media company that had prevented his rehabilitation. You researched her travel schedule, knowing that eventually you'd find a flight where both she and I would be aboard, Owen said. This was always about facing me, wasn't it? I wanted to prove that your precious skills and training meant nothing when real lives were on the line, Sandro admitted. I wanted to watch you fail to save people, just like I failed to save my life after you destroyed it. Owen felt a mixture of pity and disgust for the man across from him. Victor, you had a choice when you got out of prison. You could have rebuilt your life legitimately, made amends for what you'd done. Instead, you chose to become exactly what I said you were in Kabul, a terrorist. Don't you dare judge me, Sandro snarled. You went home to your perfect little life with your daughter and your quiet job while I lost everything. My wife left me. My children won't speak to me. I couldn't even get a job managing a fast food restaurant because of that. Documentary. The rage and self-pity in Sandro's voice revealed the fundamental difference between the two men. Owen had chosen to rebuild his life around service and responsibility, while Sandro had chosen to nurture his grievances and plan revenge. The hijacking was never going to succeed, Owen said quietly. You knew I was on that plane. You knew what I was capable of. This was elaborate suicide by proxy, wasn't it? Sandro's silence confirmed Owen's assessment. The entire operation had been designed to force a confrontation that Sandro couldn't win, but would at least allow him to inflict some measure of pain on the people he blamed for his downfall. Agent Santos entered the room, having heard enough to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. Mr. Dramer, based on what we've just heard, you're looking at charges of domestic terrorism, hijacking, conspiracy, and attempted murder. The federal prosecutor is talking about seeking the death penalty. Sandro laughed bitterly. Perfect. Viktor Kozlov finally gets what he deserved, and Owen Trellis gets to be the hero again. The story writes itself. Owen stood to leave, feeling the weight of 7 years of history settling on his shoulders. Victor, for what it's worth, I'm sorry your life turned out this way. But you made your choices just like I made mine. As Owen walked toward the door, Sandro called after him. This isn't over, Marcus. The media is going to want to know everything about the mysterious hero who saved Flight 447. Your quiet little life in Boulder is finished. Soon everyone will know exactly who Owen Trellis really is. Owen paused at the door, understanding that Sandro's final revenge might be the exposure that would shatter the peaceful anonymity he had built for himself and Morel. Maybe, but unlike you, I'm not afraid of the consequences of my choices. As he left the interview room, Owen realized that the confrontation on Flight 447 had been just the beginning. The real challenge would be protecting his daughter from the media storm that was about to engulf their quiet life, and figuring out how to integrate his past with the future he was trying to build. In the waiting area, Morel looked up from her book with the kind of perceptive intelligence that always amazed him. Dad, you look worried. Is everything going to be okay? Owen sat down beside his daughter, choosing his words carefully. Things are going to change for us, sweetheart. People are going to want to know about what happened on the plane, and that means they're going to want to know about me. About us. Morel studied her father's face with the same analytical skills that made her an excellent student. Are you afraid of what people will think when they find out about your old job? I'm not afraid for me, Owen said honestly. I'm afraid for you. I wanted to give you a normal childhood, away from all the complications of what I used to do. Morel reached over and took her father's hand. Dad, what's normal about having a father who's brave enough to save a plane full of people? I think that's pretty amazing. Owen squeezed his daughter's hand, drawing strength from her unwavering faith in him. Whatever came next, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else since her mother's death. But as media vans began gathering in the airport parking lot and his phone started buzzing with calls from reporters who had somehow obtained his number, Owen knew that their quiet life in Boulder was indeed about to change forever. 3 days after Flight 447, Owen Trellis sat in his modest living room in Boulder, watching news coverage of his own story on television while Morel did homework at the kitchen table. The media had dubbed him the Guardian, Angel of Flight 447, and every major network was running features about the mysterious single father who had saved hundreds of lives with skills that seemed impossible for a community college employee. The knock on his front door came at exactly 7 in the evening, as Owen had been expecting. Through the peephole, he saw Celine Thalrick standing on his doorstep, looking remarkably different from the polished executive he had met on the plane. She wore simple jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, but her eyes held the same intensity that had impressed him during their first encounter. Ms. Thalrick, Owen said as he opened the door. I wasn't sure you'd actually come. I told you I would, Celine replied. And please, call me Celine. After what we've been through together, I think we're past formalities. Owen invited her in, noting how she took in the details of his home with journalist's eyes. The living room was comfortable but modest, decorated with Morel's school achievements and family photos that told the story of a close father-daughter relationship. Military awards and commendations were notably absent, replaced by soccer trophies and science fair ribbons. Your home is lovely, Celine said sincerely. It feels like a real family lives here. Morel looked up from her calculus homework, recognizing their visitor immediately. Ms. Thalrick, Dad said you might visit. Are you here to interview him for your new show? Celine smiled warmly at the teenager. Actually, I'm here because I wanted to thank your father properly, and to talk to both of you about something important. But first, I'm curious about what you think of all this media attention. Morel glanced at her father before answering. It's weird, but also kind of cool. I mean, I always knew Dad was special, but I didn't know he was that special. Though honestly, the reporters are kind of annoying. They keep calling during dinner. Owen had been fielding media requests for 3 days, turning down every interview request and declining to comment, beyond a brief statement thanking the flight crew and passengers for their cooperation. His strategy was to wait for the story to fade from the news cycle, but Celine's presence suggested that might not be possible. Owen, Celine said, settling into the chair across from him, I've spent the last 3 days researching your military service, or at least the parts that aren't classified. What I found is remarkable, but it also raises questions about why someone with your background chose such a different path. Owen had been dreading this conversation, but he recognized that Celine deserved the full truth after what they had been through together. What specific questions do you have? What specific questions do you have? Celine pulled out a tablet and consulted her notes, her professional instincts taking over. You enlisted in the Navy at 18, went through SEAL training, and spent 12 years in special operations. Your service record includes deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, and several classified locations. You received the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart. Then 5 years ago, you abruptly left the military and disappeared from public record until you surfaced as a facilities manager in Boulder. That's accurate, Owen confirmed, wondering how much of the classified details Celine had managed to uncover. What happened in Afghanistan, Owen? I know about Viktor Kozlov's conviction for arms trafficking, and I know your testimony was crucial to the case. But there's more to it, isn't there? Owen was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. Morel had stopped pretending to do homework and was listening intently, clearly hungry for details about her father's past that he had never shared. Operation Red Wing 3, Owen said finally. That's what they called the mission where we uncovered Viktor's operation. It was supposed to be a routine intelligence gathering assignment, working with local contractors to identify Taliban weapons caches in the Kabul region. Owen's voice took on the measured tone of someone recounting events that still carried emotional weight. Viktor Kozlov was our primary local asset, a former Spetsnaz operator who claimed to have inside knowledge of insurgent activities. For 3 months, he fed us intelligence that led to successful raids and weapons seizures. We trusted him completely. Celine made notes on her tablet, but her attention was focused entirely on Owen's face as he spoke. What changed? We started noticing patterns in the ambushes we were encountering. Owen continued. The insurgents seemed to know our routes, our timing, even our communication frequencies. Our casualties were mounting, and conventional counterintelligence wasn't identifying the leak. Morel moved to the couch, sitting beside her father as he recounted events she had never heard before. Owen unconsciously placed a protective arm around his daughter, drawing comfort from her presence as he revisited one of the darkest periods of his military career. I convinced my commanding officer to let me run an unauthorized surveillance operation on our own support personnel, Owen said. For 2 weeks, I tracked Viktor's movements during his off-duty hours, using skills I'd learned in advanced reconnaissance training. The story that emerged was one of betrayal on a scale that had shocked even experienced counterintelligence officers. Viktor had been systematically photographing American equipment and documenting operational procedures, then selling the information to Taliban commanders for enormous sums. More damaging, he'd been providing insurgents with American weapons and communications gear, directly contributing to attacks that had killed 14 American soldiers and countless Afghan civilians. The night I gathered definitive proof, Viktor was in the process of transferring a shipment of shoulder-fired missiles to known terrorists. Owen said, his voice heavy with the memory. Those weapons would have been used to shoot down American helicopters and transport aircraft. So you stopped him, Celine said quietly. I called in backup and we raided the transfer site, Owen confirmed. Viktor tried to fight his way out, and in the process, he killed 2 of my teammates and wounded several others. I had to make a choice between capturing him alive or protecting my men. Morel squeezed her father's hand, sensing the pain in his voice. What did you do, Dad? I chose my men, Owen said simply. I neutralized Viktor's security team and took him alive, but just barely. The evidence we recovered led to the biggest military contractor corruption case in modern history. Celine looked up from her notes, understanding beginning to dawn in her expression. That's why you left the military, isn't it? Not just because of your wife's death, but because of what you'd seen. Owen nodded slowly. I testified at Viktor's court-martial and the subsequent federal trial. I saw how the system worked, how contractors could exploit American trust for profit while soldiers died. I realized that I'd spent 12 years serving an institution that was being corrupted from within by people like Viktor. But you were decorated for exposing the corruption, Celine pointed out. You were offered promotions, choice assignments. Why walk away from that? Owen looked at Morel, remembering the day he had made the decision that changed both their lives. Because my wife was dying of cancer, and my 5-year-old daughter needed a father who would be present for her life, not someone who was always deployed to places where trust was a luxury we couldn't afford. The 3 of them sat in comfortable silence for a moment, processing the weight of Owen's revelations. Celine finally understood the full scope of what had happened on Flight 447. Viktor's hijacking attempt hadn't been just about revenge or money. It had been the final act in a 7-year campaign of hatred directed at the man who had exposed his crimes and ended his lucrative criminal career. "Owen," Celine said carefully, "there's something I need to tell you about my documentary series." The episode about military contractor corruption featured Victor's case prominently, but it also included extensive coverage of the SEAL team members who exposed the operation. Your name and photograph were in the program. Owen felt his stomach tighten. "How extensively?" "We interviewed several members of your former unit, your commanding officer, even some of the families of the soldiers who were killed because of Victor's betrayal," Celine admitted. "It was one of our most watched episodes, and it won a Peabody Award for investigative journalism." Morel looked between her father and Celine, beginning to understand the complex web of connections that had led to their encounter on Flight 447. "So Victor knew who Dad was because of your show. And he knew who you were because of what Dad did to him?" "That's exactly right," Celine confirmed. "Which means that what happened on that plane wasn't random at all. Victor had been planning this for months, maybe years, waiting for the right opportunity to get revenge on both of us simultaneously." Owen stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet suburban street where he had tried to build a normal life for his daughter. "The irony is that if I hadn't exposed Victor's operation, he never would have gone to prison, never would have seen your documentary, and never would have planned this elaborate revenge." "Dad," Morel said softly, "are you saying you regret stopping him?" Owen turned back to his daughter, seeing the concern in her eyes. "No, sweetheart. I regret that good people had to pay the price for his crimes. But I don't regret stopping a terrorist from killing more innocent people." Celine closed her tablet and looked directly at Owen. "That's exactly why I'm here. What you did in Afghanistan, what you did on Flight 447, what you're doing every day as a father, it all comes from the same place. You protect people because that's who you are, not because of your training or your job title." Owen sensed that Celine was building toward something significant, but he wasn't prepared for what came next. "Owen Trellis," she said, her voice taking on the formality of someone making an important pronouncement, "I have a proposition for you that could change everything." The next morning brought a crisis that would test every skill Owen Trellis had ever learned and every principle he held dear. He was making breakfast for Morel when his phone rang with a call from Special Agent Santos, her voice tight with urgency. "Owen, we have a situation. Victor Kozlov escaped federal custody 2 hours ago during a prison transport. He killed 2 guards and wounded 3 others in the process. We have reason to believe he's heading toward Colorado." Owen set down the spatula and moved away from the kitchen where Morel was eating cereal, lowering his voice. "How is that possible? He was supposed to be in maximum security." "He had help," Santos replied grimly. "We've identified at least 2 accomplices who staged the escape, both with military backgrounds and grudges against the system. Owen, this man is completely unhinged. He left a message at the scene saying this is far from over." Through the kitchen window, Owen could see a news van parked across the street, one of several that had been maintaining surveillance on his home since the Flight 447 story broke. "Agent Santos, I'm going to take Morel somewhere safe. Can you arrange protection for Celine Thalric? If Victor is coming after me, she's probably a target too." "Already done," Santos confirmed. "But Owen, we need you to consider the possibility that this is bigger than just personal revenge. Victor's accomplices have backgrounds in domestic terrorism. This could be the beginning of a coordinated attack on multiple targets." Owen felt the familiar coldness settling over him, the mental state that had served him through countless dangerous missions. "Send me everything you have on the accomplices. Backgrounds, training, likely capabilities. I'll be in touch." After ending the call, Owen returned to the kitchen where Morel was finishing her breakfast, unaware that their world was about to be turned upside down again. "Sweetheart, we need to take a trip. Pack a bag with essentials, enough for several days." Morel looked up from her cereal, immediately sensing the change in her father's demeanor. "Dad, what's wrong?" "You have that look again. Look again." "The man from the airplane escaped from prison," Owen said, choosing honesty over false comfort. "He might try to come here, so we're going to stay somewhere safe until the police catch him." While Morel packed, Owen made 2 phone calls. The first was to his supervisor at the community college, explaining that he needed emergency family leave. The second was to Celine, warning her about Victor's escape and confirming that she was under federal protection. "Owen," Celine said, her voice strained, "there's something else. We just received a manifesto at Meridian Media Group, delivered by courier an hour ago. Victor is claiming responsibility for what he calls Operation Truth Justice, and he's threatening to target other people he blames for destroying his life." Owen felt his blood run cold. "How many targets?" 14 names on the list," Celine replied. "Military officers who testified against him, federal prosecutors who convicted him, journalists who covered the story, and civilian contractors who refused to work with him after his release. Owen, this isn't just about revenge anymore. This is domestic terrorism with a specific ideology behind it. Where are you now?" Owen asked, already formulating plans for multiple contingencies. "Federal safe house outside Atlanta," Celine said. "But Owen, I'm not hiding while this maniac threatens innocent people. Meridian is going to cover this story, and I'm going to be part of it." Owen recognized the determination in her voice, the same quality that had built a media empire from nothing. "Celine, this man has already demonstrated that he's willing to kill federal agents. He won't hesitate to target journalists, which is exactly why this story needs to be told," she replied firmly. "The public deserves to know what's happening and why." 20 minutes later, Owen and Morel were driving north toward a safe house owned by a former SEAL teammate who lived in the mountains outside Denver. Owen had made the arrangements through encrypted communication channels, using protocols that hadn't been activated since his military service ended. "Dad," Morel said as they drove through the Colorado foothills, "are we going to have to keep running from this guy?" Owen considered his answer carefully. "No, sweetheart. Running only works temporarily. Eventually, you have to turn and face the problem." What Owen didn't tell his daughter was that he had already made the decision to end Victor's campaign of terror permanently. The escape from federal custody had escalated the situation beyond what law enforcement could handle effectively. Victor and his accomplices were now operating as a terrorist cell with military training and personal vendettas driving their actions. The safe house belonged to Master Chief Petty, Officer retired Jonathan Reeves, Owen's former team leader and one of the few people who understood the full scope of what Victor Kozlov represented. Reeves had been following the news coverage of Flight 447 with professional interest, recognizing his former subordinate's skills in the media reports. "Marcus," Reeves said, using Owen's old call sign as they shook hands, "I figured you'd show up here eventually. Come on in, both of you." The mountain cabin was isolated and defensible, equipped with military-grade communication equipment and security systems that would detect any approach long before threats became immediate. Morel was fascinated by the technology, asking intelligent questions that impressed Reeves with her understanding of complex systems. "Your daughter has good instincts," Reeves told Owen privately while Morel explored the cabin's defensive features. "She's handling this situation better than most adults would." Owen watched his daughter, examining the perimeter sensors with scientific curiosity rather than fear. "She's stronger than I ever imagined. I've tried to protect her from my past, but maybe that was a mistake." Reeves pulled up intelligence reports on his secure computer, showing Owen what federal agencies had learned about Victor's escape and his accomplices. "Marcus, this is bigger than one man's revenge fantasy. Victor has connected with a domestic terrorist network that's been planning attacks on government targets for months. Your case just gave them a focal point for their ideology." The intelligence was sobering. Victor's primary accomplice was Damian Cross, a former Army Ranger who had been dishonorably discharged for planning attacks on civilian targets. The second accomplice was Rachel Torres, a former military intelligence officer who had been court-martialed for selling classified information to foreign governments. They're calling themselves the Justice Coalition, Reeves continued, and their manifesto claims that the American military-industrial complex is corrupt beyond redemption. They're targeting people they see as symbols of that corruption. Owen studied the psychological profiles, recognizing the dangerous combination of military training and extremist ideology. They're not just seeking revenge. They're trying to start a larger conflict. Reeves nodded grimly. The FBI's hostage rescue team is mobilizing, but these people know how to stay off the grid. They could strike anywhere, anytime, and law enforcement is always going to be one step behind. That evening, as Morrell slept in the cabin's secure bedroom, Owen made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He contacted Celine through encrypted channels, proposing a plan that would end Victor's campaign of terror but would require her to take an enormous personal risk. "You want to use me as bait," Celine said after Owen explained his strategy. "I want to give Victor what he thinks he wants," Owen corrected. "A chance to confront both of us simultaneously, in a controlled environment where innocent people won't be harmed." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Meridian Media Group would announce a live television special about the Flight 447 incident, featuring exclusive interviews with both Owen and Celine. The location would be deliberately leaked through channels that Victor's network was known to monitor, creating an irresistible target for his final act of revenge. "Owen," Celine said quietly, "you're talking about deliberately putting yourself in harm's way to protect strangers. That's not your responsibility anymore." Owen looked through the cabin window at the mountain peaks silhouetted against the starlit sky, thinking about the life he had built with Morrell and the future he wanted her to have. "It became my responsibility the moment Victor made it clear that he won't stop until he's dead or captured. I can either wait for him to strike at targets of his choosing, or I can control the circumstances of our final confrontation." Celine was quiet for a long moment. "If we do this, if we set this trap, there's no guarantee that you'll survive it. Victor has military-trained accomplices now, and they'll be prepared for your capabilities. Then I'll have to be better prepared for theirs." Owen replied simply. The next morning, Meridian Media Group announced a primetime special titled, "Heroes and Terrorists: The True Story of Flight 447. The program would feature exclusive interviews with Owen Trellis and Celine Thauric, broadcast live from Meridian's Denver studio facility. Security for the event would be provided by a combination of federal agents and private contractors, creating what appeared to be a high-value target with manageable defenses. Within hours of the announcement, federal surveillance detected increased activity among Victor's known associates. The trap was set, and the most dangerous game of Owen's life was about to begin. But as he watched Morrell help Reeves calibrate the cabin's defense systems, Owen realized that this confrontation would determine more than just his own survival. It would decide what kind of world his daughter would inherit, and whether the skills he had spent years trying to leave behind would ultimately serve their highest purpose, protecting the innocent from those who would harm them. The warrior was fully awake now, but this time he would fight not for country or mission, but for the simple right of a teenage girl to grow up in a world where justice prevailed over vengeance. Meridian Media Group studio in Denver buzzed with controlled tension as technicians made final preparations for the live broadcast. Owen Trellis sat across from Celine Thauric on the interview set, both wearing subtle communication devices that connected them to the federal tactical team positioned throughout the building. To television viewers, they appeared to be simply discussing the Flight 447 incident. In reality, they were the central pieces of an elaborate trap. "We're living 30 seconds, announced the floor director, unaware that snipers were positioned on surrounding rooftops and that every person in the studio had been background checked. by federal agents. Celine looked directly into camera. One as the red recording light activated. Good evening. I'm Celine Thalric with a special investigation into the events of Flight 447 and the domestic terrorist network that has emerged from those events. With me is Owen Trellis, the man whose actions saved hundreds of lives and exposed a conspiracy that threatens American security. Owen had insisted on using his real identity for the broadcast, understanding that hiding would only prolong Victor's campaign of terror. Ms. Thalric, what people need to understand is that Viktor Kozlov represents something larger than personal revenge. He's become the focal point for individuals who believe violence is justified when they feel wronged by the system. As if summoned by his name, the studio's security alarms began shrieking. Victor and his two accomplices had breached the building's perimeter exactly as Owen had predicted, using military tactics to neutralize external defenses and create multiple entry points. "Ladies and gentlemen," Celine said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them, "what you're witnessing is happening live. The terrorist Viktor Kozlov is attempting to attack this broadcast, proving the very points we've been discussing about domestic extremism." The studio cameras continued rolling as federal agents engaged Victor's team throughout the building. Owen remained seated, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the armed confrontation unfolding on live television. He had positioned himself and Celine in the most defensible location within the studio, forcing Victor to come to them if he wanted his revenge. "Victor," Owen called out as explosions echoed through the building. "You wanted to face me directly. Here I am. No hiding, no military backup, just the truth being broadcast to the world." Viktor Kozlov burst through the studio doors, flanked by Damian Cross and Rachel Torres. All three wore tactical gear and carried military-grade weapons, their faces twisted with the fanaticism of people who had moved beyond rational thought into pure ideology. "Commander Marcus," Victor snarled, using Owen's old call sign. "Finally ready to face the consequences of your righteousness?" Owen stood slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "Victor, millions of people are watching this broadcast. They're seeing exactly who you really are and what you represent. Is this the legacy you want?" "Legacy?" Victor laughed harshly. "You destroyed my legacy when you decided to play hero in Afghanistan. Now I'm going to destroy yours." What happened next demonstrated why Owen Trellis had been considered one of the military's most effective special operations personnel. As Victor's team raised their weapons, Owen moved with a speed and precision that seemed to defy physics. He dove behind the interview desk, simultaneously triggering hidden smoke grenades that federal agents had positioned throughout the studio. In the confusion that followed, Owen systematically neutralized each terrorist using a combination of tactical knowledge and environmental advantages. Damian Cross found himself disarmed and unconscious before he could fire a shot. Rachel Torres discovered that her military intelligence training was no match for someone who had spent years perfecting close-quarters combat techniques. Victor, realizing his carefully planned revenge was collapsing around him, made a desperate lunge towards Celine with a combat knife. Owen intercepted him mid-stride, using precise pressure points to disable Victor's attack while avoiding lethal force. "It's over, Victor," Owen said quietly, restraining the man who had haunted his nightmares for 7 years. "Your war ends here." Federal agents swarmed the studio as the cameras continued broadcasting every moment of the confrontation to a global audience. Victor's capture was being witnessed by millions of people, creating an undeniable record of his terrorist activities and the ideological network he represented. "Ladies and gentlemen," Celine said, addressing the cameras as federal agents secured the scene around her, "what you've just witnessed is the end of a domestic terrorist campaign that threatened dozens of innocent lives. Viktor Kozlov and his accomplices have been captured, and their network has been exposed." Agent Santos appeared on camera, reading Victor his rights while the defeated terrorist stared at Owen with a mixture of hatred and bewildered respect. "Mr. Kozlov, you're under arrest for domestic terrorism, multiple counts of murder, and conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism against the United States." As Victor was led away in restraints, he called back to Owen one final time. "You think this changes anything? You think stopping me makes the world a better place?" Owen looked directly into the camera, speaking not just to Victor, but to the millions of viewers watching the broadcast. "I think protecting innocent people from those who would harm them is always the right choice, regardless of the personal cost. That's what service means, whether you're wearing a uniform or just trying to be a good neighbor." The live broadcast had accomplished more than just capturing Victor and his accomplices. It had exposed the entire domestic terrorist network, provided evidence for federal prosecutors, and demonstrated that extremist ideology could not triumph over principled action. But for Owen Trellis, the most important outcome was simpler. His daughter would grow up in a world where at least one source of evil had been permanently removed. 3 weeks after the dramatic conclusion of Victor Kozlov's terrorist campaign, Owen Trellis sat in the same Denver coffee shop where he had once shared quiet conversations with Morel about college applications and weekend plans. Now everything had changed. The modest single father who had tried to blend into suburban anonymity had become a household name, his story inspiring countless articles about heroism, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. The morning newspapers, spread across his table, told the story of Victor's sentencing to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. His accomplices Damian Cross and Rachel Torres had received similar sentences after pleading guilty to domestic terrorism charges. The Justice Coalition network had been completely dismantled, with federal agents arresting 17 additional conspirators across 6 states. But for Owen, the most meaningful headline was smaller, buried on page 6 of the local Boulder newspaper. "Community College Facilities Manager Honored for Service." Article described how Colorado Mountain Community College had created the Owen Trellis Scholarship for students pursuing careers in public service, funded by donations from grateful community members who had watched his story unfold on national television. "Dad, you're famous again," Morel said, sliding into the seat across from him with her usual morning enthusiasm. At 16, she had handled the media attention with remarkable maturity, giving carefully considered interviews about growing up with a father whose quiet strength had shaped her understanding of courage and responsibility. "Temporarily famous," Owen corrected with a smile. "Give it another month and people will move on to the next story." Morel studied her father's face with the perceptive intelligence that never failed to amaze him. "But you're different now. You're not trying to hide anymore." Owen considered her observation carefully. She was right, of course. The events of the past month had forced him to integrate the two sides of his identity, the special operations warrior and the devoted father, in ways he had never imagined possible. He no longer felt the need to compartmentalize his past or apologize for the skills that had saved hundreds of lives. "I think I'm finally comfortable with who I am," he admitted. "All of who I am." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Celine Thelrick, who had become a regular presence in their lives since the conclusion of Victor's case. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had faced genuine danger and emerged stronger for the experience. "Good morning, Trellis family," she said warmly, settling into the empty chair at their table. "I hope you don't mind me crashing your breakfast tradition." Morel grinned at Celine, clearly delighted by the interruption. Over the past 3 weeks, she had developed a genuine fondness for the media executive who treated her as an intellectual equal and never talked down to her about complex issues. "Actually," Celine continued, "I'm here because I have something important to discuss with both of you. Something that could change all of our lives in ways I never expected." Owen raised an eyebrow at the formal tone in her voice, recognizing the signs of someone about to make a significant announcement. That sounds ominous. Not ominous, Celine replied, pulling out a leather portfolio. Extraordinary. She opened the portfolio to reveal documents that Owen recognized as corporate legal papers, though their specific purpose wasn't immediately clear. Owen, over the past month, I've been thinking about what happened on Flight 447, about Victor's campaign of terror, and about what it all means for the future of media and security in this country. Celine paused, choosing her words carefully. What I realized is that traditional approaches to both journalism and security are failing. We need something different, something that combines investigative reporting with the kind of real-world expertise that can actually protect people from genuine threats. Owen sensed where this conversation was heading, but the scope of what Celine was proposing was beyond anything he had imagined. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm offering you a partnership, Celine said directly. Not just a job, not just a consulting position, but a true partnership in creating something entirely new. I want to launch a new division of Meridian Media Group focused on investigative security journalism, and I want you to be my co-founder and co-director. Morel's eyes widened with excitement, but Owen felt his stomach tighten with uncertainty. Celine, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not a journalist. I don't have the education or background for that kind of work. You have something better than education, Celine replied firmly. You have experience, judgment, and integrity. You understand how security threats actually work, how to assess real danger versus manufactured fear, and how to protect people while still serving the public's right to know. She pulled out additional documents, showing Owen detailed plans for investigative stories that would combine traditional journalism with security analysis. Think about it, Owen. Victor's network existed for years before anyone in the media understood the real threat they represented. How many other dangerous situations are developing right now that traditional journalists can't identify because they lack the background to recognize the warning signs? Owen studied the proposal, seeing the logic in Celine's vision, but struggling with the magnitude of what she was suggesting. This would mean completely changing my life, leaving Colorado, taking Morel away from everything familiar. Actually, Morel interjected, it wouldn't necessarily mean leaving Colorado. Both adults turned to look at her, surprised by her contribution to what they had assumed was an adult conversation. What do you mean, sweetheart? Owen asked. Morel pulled out her own folder, revealing college brochures and application materials. I've been researching journalism programs since the Flight 447 incident, and the University of Colorado has one of the best investigative journalism schools in the country. If I got accepted there, we could stay in state, and you could build this new company wherever you wanted. Owen stared at his daughter, realizing that she had been planning her own future around the possibility that his life might change dramatically. Morel, you don't have to make your college decisions based on my career choices. I'm not, she replied with the confidence that reminded him so much of her mother. I'm making my college decisions based on what I want to do with my life. And after watching you and Miss Thalrick work together, I think investigative journalism that actually protects people sounds like the most important job in the world. Celine looked between father and daughter, seeing the strong partnership that had enabled them to handle every challenge life had thrown at them. Owen, there's one more thing. This wouldn't just be a business partnership. Over the past month, I've come to care about both of you in ways that go far beyond professional respect. Owen felt his heart rate increase as he recognized the personal dimension Celine was adding to her proposal. What are you saying? I'm saying that I've fallen in love with a man who risked everything to protect strangers, who raised an extraordinary daughter while maintaining his principles, and who represents everything I believe about courage and integrity, Celine said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. I'm asking you to consider not just a business partnership, but a life partnership. The coffee shop around them seemed to fade away as Owen processed the full scope of what Celine was offering. A career that would utilize all of his skills in service of truth and protection. A location that would allow Morel to pursue her dreams. And most unexpectedly, a relationship with someone who understood both his past and his values. "Dad," Morel said quietly, "she's asking you to marry her." Owen looked at his daughter, seeing not the little girl he had been protecting all these years, but a young woman who was ready to support him in building a new chapter of their lives. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Morel smiled with the wisdom that had always made her seem older than her years. "I think Mom would want you to be happy. And I think Miss Thalrick makes you happy in a way you haven't been since Mom died." Owen turned back to Celine, seeing in her eyes the same kind of commitment and partnership that had defined his marriage to Morel's mother. "You're asking me to trust you with everything that matters to me. I'm asking you to build something meaningful with someone who loves you," Celine replied simply. "The business partnership is just the framework. The real proposal is about creating a life together where we can both be who we're meant to be." Owen reached across the table and took Celine's hand, feeling the rightness of the decision even as he made it. "Yes, yes to the business partnership?" Celine asked. "Yes to all of it," Owen said, his voice carrying the certainty that had guided him through every important decision of his life. "The partnership, the company, the future we're going to build together," Morel cheered softly, earning smiles from other patrons in the coffee shop who had been discreetly listening to the dramatic conversation unfolding. At the corner table, 6 months later, Owen Trellis stood in the newsroom of Truth and Security Investigations, the groundbreaking media company he had co-founded with his wife, Celine Trellis. Their first major investigation had exposed a domestic terrorist cell planning attacks on university campuses, saving countless lives while setting new standards for security-focused journalism. Morel, now a freshman at the University of Colorado's journalism program, worked part-time at the company while completing her degree. She had inherited her father's analytical mind and her stepmother's communication skills, already showing promise as the next generation of investigative reporters. As Owen watched his family work together to build something meaningful and lasting, he realized that the warrior and the father were no longer separate parts of his identity. They had become integrated into something greater, a protector who served truth, a leader who chose love over fear, and a man who had finally found his way home. The quiet single father from Boulder was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the greatest victories weren't won in secret, but in the light of truth, surrounded by people who shared your values and supported your dreams. Their story had not ended with the capture of a terrorist. It had begun with the proposal that rewrote their destinies and proved that courage and love could indeed change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.